New limits, new horizons. In the Middle East, Europeans were until very recently called Franks, a word first used in Byzantium to mean Western Christians. It caught on elsewhere and was still being used in various distortions and mispronunciations from the Persian Gulf to China 1,000 years later. This is more than just a historical curiosity, it is a helpful reminder that non-Europeans were struck from the start by the unity, not the diversity, of the Western peoples and long thought of them as one. The roots of this idea can be seen even in the remote beginnings of Europe's long and victorious assault on the world, when a relaxation of pressure on her eastern land frontier and northern coasts at last began to be felt. By AD 1000 or so, the outsiders were checked, then they began to be Christianized. Within a short space of time Poland, Hungary, Denmark and Norway came to be ruled by Christian kings. One last great threat, the Mongol onslaught, still lay ahead, it is true, but that was unimaginable at that time. By the 11th century, too, the rolling back of Islam had already begun. Palermo was conquered by recently Christianized Normans in 1071 after 250 years under Muslim rule. The Islamic influence on southern Europe diminished because of the decline into which the Abbasid Caliphate had fallen in the 8th and 9th centuries. The struggle with Islam was to continue vigorously until the 15th century. It was given unity and fervor by Christianity, the deepest source of European self-consciousness. Similar fervor came to be generated among Muslims, at times proclaimed as a jihad or holy war, but its effects seemed less far-reaching and profound than among Europeans whom religion bound together in a great moral and spiritual enterprise. It fed their sense of identity. But that was only one side of the coin. It also provided a license for the predatory appetites of the military class which dominated lay society. Crusading warfare would offer loot and license on a scale unavailable in Christendom's domestic wars. They could despoil the pagans with clear consciences. The Normans, always great predators, were in the vanguard, taking South Italy and Sicily from the Arabs, a task effectively complete by 1100. Almost incidentally they swallowed the last Byzantine possessions in the west as well. The other great struggle in Europe against Islam was the epic of Spanish history, the Reconquest, whose climax came in 1492 when Granada, the last Muslim capital of Spain, fell to the armies of the Catholic monarchs. The Spaniards had come to see the Reconquest as a religious cause, and as such it had been able to attract land-hungry warriors from all over Europe since its beginnings in the 11th century. But it had also drawn on the same religious revival and quickening of vigor in the West which expressed itself in a succession of great enterprises in Syria and Palestine which are remembered as the Crusades. Strictly applied, that name covers a much longer drawn-out and geographically more widely spread series of events than those of the couple of centuries or so which are usually thought of as the crusading era. The essential of the crusade was the authorization by the Pope that those taking part in it would be entitled to indulgences, allowing them remissions of the time to be spent after death in purgatory and, sometimes, the status of martyr if they died while actually on crusade. On this basis, crusades were still being launched as late as the 15th century, often against targets far different from the ambition to do great deeds in the Holy Land which had fired the first crusaders, against Moors in Spain, pagan Slavs in the Baltic lands, Christian heretics in France, and even against Christian monarchs who had incurred the wrath of the Pope. As shaping forces, though, the first four crusades were incomparably the most important. Though unsuccessful in their aim, they did not restore the Holy Land to Christian rule, they left profound legacies. In the Levant they briefly established new colonial societies, they gravely, perhaps mortally, wounded the Eastern Christian Empire, above all, they enduringly marked the psychology and self-consciousness of Western Europeans. The earliest and most successful was launched in 1096. Within 3 years the Crusaders recaptured Jerusalem, where they celebrated the triumph of the gospel of peace by an appalling massacre of their prisoners, women and children included. The Second Crusade, 1147-9, in contrast, began with a successful massacre of Jews in the Rhineland, but thereafter, though the presence of an emperor and a king of France gave it greater importance than its predecessor, it was a disaster. It failed to recover Edessa, the city whose loss had largely provoked it, and did much to discredit Saint Bernard, its most fervent advocate, though it had a byproduct of some importance when an English fleet took Lisbon from the Arabs and it passed into the hands of the King of Portugal. Then in 1187 Saladin recaptured Jerusalem for Islam. The Third Crusade, which followed, 1189–92, was socially the most spectacular. A German emperor, who drowned in the course of it, and the kings of England and France all took part. They quarrelled and the Crusaders failed to recover Jerusalem. No great monarch answered Pope Innocent III's appeal to go on the next crusade, though many land-hungry magnates did. The Venetians financed the expedition, which left in 1202. It was at once diverted by interference in the dynastic troubles of Byzantium, which suited the Venetians, who helped to recapture Constantinople for a deposed emperor. There followed the terrible sack of the city in 1204, and that was the end of the Fourth Crusade, whose monument was the establishment of a Latin empire at Constantinople, which survived there only for half a century. Several more crusades set out in the 13th century, but though they helped to put off a little longer the dangers which faced Byzantium, the last Christian stronghold in Palestine, Acre, fell to the Muslims in 1281, and thereafter crusading to the Holy Land was dead as an independent force. Religious impulse could still move men, but the first four crusades had too often shown the unpleasant face of greed. They were the first examples of European overseas imperialism, both in their characteristic mixture of noble and ignoble aims and in their abortive settler colonialism. Whereas in Spain, and on the pagan marches of Germany, Europeans were pushing forward a frontier of settlement, they tried in Syria and Palestine to transplant Western institutions to a remote and exotic setting, as well as to seize lands and goods no longer easily available in Europe itself. They did this with clear consciences because their opponents were infidels who had by conquest installed themselves in Christianity's most sacred shrines. Christians are right, pagans are wrong, went the Song of Roland, and that probably sums up well enough the average crusader's response to any qualms about what he was doing. The brief successes of the First Crusade owed much to a passing phase of weakness and anarchy in the Islamic world. The feeble transplants of the Frankish states and the Latin Empire of Constantinople would not last. But there were to be more enduring results, above all in the relations of Christianity and Islam, creating for centuries a sense of unbridgeable ideological separation between two faiths which have very similar origins. What one scholar has well called a flood of misrepresentation of Islam was well underway in Western Christendom early in the 12th century. Among other things, it ended the possibility of the two religions living side by side, as they had sometimes done in Spain, as well as halting the corrosion of Christian culture there by Muslim learning. But the division of Christendom was embittered, too, by the Crusades. The sack of Constantinople had been the work of crusaders. The Crusades had a legacy, moreover, in a new temper in Western Christianity, a militant tone and an aggressiveness which would often break out in centuries to come, when it would also be able to exploit technological superiority. In it lay the roots of a mentality which, when secularized, would power the world-conquering culture of the modern era. The reconquest was scarcely to be complete before the Spanish would look to the Americas for the battlefield of a new crusade. Yet Europe was never impervious to Islamic influence. In these struggles she imported and invented new habits and institutions. Wherever they encountered Islam, whether in the crusading lands, Sicily or Spain, Western Europeans found things to admire. Sometimes they took up luxuries not to be found at home: silk clothes, the use of perfumes and new dishes. One habit acquired by some crusaders was that of taking more frequent baths. This may have been unfortunate, for it added the taint of religious infidelity to a habit already discouraged in Europe, where bathhouses were associated with sexual license. Cleanliness had not yet achieved its later quasi-automatic association with godliness. One institution crystallizing the militant Christianity of the High Middle Ages was the military order of knighthood. It brought together soldiers who professed vows as members of a religious order and of an accepted discipline to fight for the faith. Some of these orders became very rich, owning endowments in many countries. The Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, who are still in existence, were to be for centuries in the forefront of the battle against Islam. The Knights Templar rose to such great power and prosperity that they were destroyed by a French king who feared them, and the Spanish military orders of Calatrava and Santiago were in the forefront of the reconquest. Another military order operated in the north, the Teutonic Knights, the warrior monks who were the spearhead of Germanic penetration of the Baltic and Slav lands. There, too, missionary zeal combined with greed and the stimulus of poverty to change both the map and the culture of a whole region. The colonizing impulse which failed in the Middle East had lasting success further north. German expansion eastwards comprised a huge folk movement, a centuries-long tide of men and women clearing forest, planting homesteads and villages, founding towns, building fortresses to protect them and monasteries and churches to serve them. While the great expansion of the German East between 1100 and 1400 made a new economic, cultural and ethnic map, it also raised yet another barrier to the union of the two Christian traditions. Papal supremacy in the West made the Catholicism of the late medieval period more uncompromising and more unacceptable than ever to orthodoxy. From the 12th century onwards, Russia was more and more separated from Western Europe by her own traditions and special historical experience. The Mongol capture of Kiev in 1240 had been a blow to Eastern Christianity as grave as the sack of Constantinople in 1204. It also broke the princes of Muscovy. With Byzantium in decline and the Germans and Swedes on their backs, the Russians were to pay tribute to the Mongols and their Tatar successors of the Golden Horde for centuries. This long domination by a Eurasian nomadic people was another historical experience sundering Russia from most of Europe. Tatar domination had its greatest impact on the southern Russian principalities, the area where the Mongol armies had operated. A new balance within Russia appeared. Novgorod and Moscow acquired new importance after the eclipse of Kiev, though both paid tribute to the Tatars in the form of silver, recruits and labor. Their emissaries, like other Russian princes, had to go to the Tatar capital at Sarai on the Volga, and make their separate arrangements with their conquerors. It was a period of the greatest dislocation and confusion in the succession patterns of the Russian states. Both Tatar policy and the struggle to survive favored those which were most despotic. The future political tradition of Russia was thus now shaped by the Tatar experience as it had been by the inheritance of imperial ideas from Byzantium. Gradually Moscow emerged as the focus of a new centralizing trend. The process can be discerned as early as the reign of Alexander Nevsky's son, who was Prince of Muscovy. His successors had the support of the Tatars, who found them efficient tax gatherers. The church offered no resistance and the metropolitan archbishopric was transferred from Vladimir to Moscow in the 14th century. Meanwhile, a new challenge to orthodoxy had arisen in Europe. The last pagan nation on the continent, the Lithuanians, converted to Catholicism in the late 14th century, and their Grand Duke Jogaila incorporated large areas of Slav land into his possessions, including sizable parts of Prussia, Poland and the Ukraine, with the city of Kiev, which they held for 3 centuries. From the 16th century they formed an aristocratic republic, with elected kings in what was called the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Fortunately for the Russians, the Lithuanians fought the Germans, too. It was they who shattered the Teutonic Knights at Tannenberg in 1410. The fall of Constantinople brought a great change to Russia. Eastern Orthodoxy had now to find its center there, and not in Byzantium. Russian churchmen soon came to feel that a complex purpose lay in such awful events. Byzantium, they believed, had betrayed its heritage by seeking religious compromise at the Council of Florence. Constantinople has fallen, wrote the Metropolitan of Moscow, because it has deserted the true Orthodox faith. There exists only one true church on earth, the Church of Russia. A few decades later, at the beginning of the 16th century, a monk could write to the ruler of Muscovy in a quite new tone: 2 Romes have fallen, but the third stands and a fourth will not be. Thou art the only Christian sovereign in the world, the Lord of all faithful Christians. The end of Byzantium came when other historical changes made Russia's emergence from confusion and Tatar domination possible and likely. The Golden Horde was rent by dissension in the 15th century, and the Lithuanian expansion had stopped. These were opportunities, and a ruler who was capable of exploiting them came to the throne of Muscovy in 1462. Ivan the Great, Ivan III, gave Russia something like the definition and reality won by England and France from the 12th century onwards. Some have seen him as the first national ruler of Russia. Territorial consolidation was the foundation of his work. When Muscovy swallowed the republics of Pskov and Novgorod, his authority stretched at least in theory as far as the Urals. The oligarchies which had ruled the republics were deported, to be replaced by men who held lands from Ivan in return for service. The German merchants of the Hanse who had dominated the trade of these republics were expelled, too. The Tatars made another onslaught on Moscow in 1481 but were beaten off, and 2 invasions of Lithuania gave Ivan much of White Russia and Little Russia in 1503. His successor took Smolensk in 1514. Ivan the Great was the first Russian ruler to take the title of Tsar. It was a conscious evocation of an imperial past, a claim to the heritage of the Caesars, the word from which it originated. In 1472 Ivan married a niece of the last Byzantine emperor. He was called autocrat by the grace of God, and during his reign the double-headed eagle was adopted, which was to remain part of the insignia of Russian rulers until 1917. This gave a further Byzantine coloring to Russian monarchy and Russian history, which became still more unlike that of Western Europe. By 1500 Western Europeans already recognized a distinctive kind of monarchy in Russia. Basil, Ivan's successor, was acknowledged to have a despotic power over his subjects greater than that of any other Christian rulers over theirs. With a solid portion of hindsight, some of Europe's future may be glimpsed already by 1500. A great process of redefinition and realization had been going on for centuries. Europe's land limits were now filled up. In the east further advance was blocked by the consolidation of Christian Russia, in the Balkans by the Ottoman Empire of Islam. The first, crusading, wave of overseas expansion was virtually spent by about 1250. With the onset of Ottoman rule in the 15th century, Europe was again forced on the defensive in the eastern Mediterranean and Balkans. Those unhappy states with exposed territories in the east, such as Venice, had to look after them as best they could. Meanwhile, others were taking a new look at their oceanic horizons. A new phase of Western Europe's relations with the rest of the world was about to open. In 1400 Europeans had still seen Jerusalem as the center of the world. Though the Vikings had crossed the Atlantic, men could still think of a world which, though spherical, was made up of 3 continents, Europe, Asia and Africa, around the shores of one landlocked sea, the Mediterranean. A huge revolution, the greatest since the Mongol expansion, lay just ahead. It would forever sweep away such views. The route to it lay across the oceans because elsewhere advance was blocked. Europe's first direct contacts with Asia had been on land rather than on water. The caravan routes of Central Eurasia were their main channel and brought goods west to be shipped from Black Sea or Levant ports. Elsewhere, ships rarely ventured far south of Morocco until the 15th century. Then, a mounting wave of maritime enterprise becomes noticeable. With it, the age of true world history was beginning. One explanation of it is technological, through the acquisition of new tools and skills. Different ships and new techniques of long-range navigation were needed for oceanic sailing, and they became available from the 14th century onwards, thus making possible the great effort of exploration which has led to the 15th century being called the Age of Reconnaissance. In ship design there were 2 crucial changes. One was specific, the adoption of the stern-post rudder, though we do not know exactly when this happened. Some ships had it by 1300. The other was a more gradual and complex process of improving rigging. This went with a growth in the size of ships. A more complex maritime trade no doubt spurred such developments. By 1500, the tubby medieval cog of northern Europe, square-rigged with a single sail and mast, had developed into a ship carrying up to 3 masts, with mixed sails. The mainmast still carried square rigging, but more than one sail. The mizzenmast had a big lateen sail borrowed from the Mediterranean tradition. A foremast might carry more square-rigged sails, but also newly invented fore and aft jib sails attached to a bowsprit. Together with the lateen sail aft, these headsails made vessels much more maneuverable. They could be sailed much closer to the wind. Once these innovations were absorbed, the design of ships which resulted was to remain essentially unchanged, though refined, until the coming of steam propulsion. Though he would have found them small and cramped, Columbus's ships would have been perfectly comprehensible machines to a 19th-century clipper captain. Since they carried guns, though tiny ones by comparison with what was to come, they would equally have been comprehensible to Nelson. By 1500 some crucial navigational developments had also taken place. The Vikings had first shown how to sail an oceanic course. They had better ships and navigational skill than anything previously available in Europe. Using the pole star and the sun, whose height above the horizon in northern latitudes at midday had been computed in tables by a 10th-century Irish astronomer, they had crossed the Atlantic by running along a line of latitude. Then, with the 13th century, there is evidence of two great innovations. At that time the compass came to be commonly used in the Mediterranean. It already existed in China, but, though it seems likely, it is not known if or how it was transmitted from Asia to the Middle East, and in 1270 there appears the first reference to a chart, one used in a ship engaged on a crusading venture. The next 2 centuries gave birth to modern geography and exploration. Spurred by the thought of commercial prizes, by missionary zeal and diplomatic possibilities, some princes began to subsidize research. In the 15th century they came to employ their own cartographers and hydrographers. Foremost among these princes was the brother of the King of Portugal, Henry, the navigator as English-speaking scholars were later to call him, unsuitably, for he never navigated anything. The Portuguese had a long Atlantic coast. They were surrounded by Spain on land, and increasingly barred from the Mediterranean trade by the experienced and armed force with which the Italians guarded it. Almost inevitably, it seems, they were bound to push out into the Atlantic. They had already started to familiarize themselves with northern waters when Prince Henry began to equip and launch a series of maritime expeditions. His initiative was decisive. From a mixture of motives, he turned his countrymen southwards. Gold and pepper, it was known, were to be found in the Sahara. Perhaps the Portuguese could discover where. Perhaps, too, there was a possibility of finding an ally here to take the Ottomans in the flank, the legendary Prester John. Certainly there were converts, glory and land to be won for the cross. Henry, for all that he did so much to launch Europe on the great expansion which transformed the globe and created one world, was a medieval man to the soles of his boots. He cautiously sought papal authority and approval for his expeditions. He had gone crusading in North Africa, taking with him a fragment of the True Cross, and had taken part in the Portuguese capture of Ceuta in 1415 which ended the Islamic stranglehold on West Mediterranean sea lanes. He dominates the beginning of the Age of Discovery, whose heart was systematic, government-subsidized research. Yet its spirit was rooted in the world of chivalry and crusade which had shaped Henry's thinking. He is an outstanding example of a man who wrought much more than he knew. The Portuguese pushed steadily south. They began by hugging the African coast, but some of the bolder among them reached the Madeiras and began to settle there already in the 1420s. In 1434 one of their captains passed Cape Bojador, an important psychological obstacle whose overcoming was Henry's first great triumph. 10 years later they rounded Cape Verde and established themselves in the Azores. By then they had perfected the Caravel, a ship which used new rigging to tackle headwinds and contrary currents on the home voyage by going right out into the Atlantic and sailing a long semicircular course home. In 1445 they reached Senegal. Their first fort was built soon after. Henry died in 1460, but by then his countrymen were ready to continue further south. In 1473 they crossed the equator and in 1487 they were at the Cape of Good Hope. Ahead lay the Indian Ocean. Arabs had long traded across it and pilots were available. There were also memories of the Chinese having been there 2 generations earlier. Beyond the Indian Ocean lay even richer sources of spices. In 1498 Vasco da Gama dropped anchor at last in Indian waters. By that time, another sailor, the Genos Columbus, had crossed the Atlantic to look for Asia, confident in the light of Ptolemaic geography that he would soon come to it. He failed. Instead, he discovered the Americas for the Catholic monarchs of Spain. In the name of the West Indies, the modern map commemorates his continuing belief that he had accomplished the discovery of islands off Asia by his astonishing venture, so different from the cautious, though brave, progress of the Portuguese around Africa. Unlike them, but unwittingly, he had in fact discovered an entire continent, though even on the much better equipped second voyage which he made in 1493 he explored only its islands. The Portuguese had reached a known continent by a new route. Soon, though to his dying day Columbus refused to admit it, even after 2 more voyages and arrival on the mainland, it began to be realized that what he had discovered might not be Asia after all. In 1494 the historic name New World was first applied to what had been found in the Western Hemisphere. Not until 1726, though, was it to be realized that Asia and America were not joined together in the region of the Bering Strait. The 2 enterprising Atlantic nations tried to come to understandings about their respective interests in a world of widening horizons. The first European treaty about trade outside European waters had been made by Portugal and Spain in 1479, when the Gulf of Guinea was reserved to the Portuguese. Now they went on to delimit spheres of influence. The Pope made a temporary award, based on a division of the world between them along a line 100 leagues west of the Azores, but this was overtaken by the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, which gave to Portugal all the lands east of a line of longitude running 370 leagues west of Cape Verde and to Spain all those lands west of it. In 1500 a Portuguese squadron on the way to the Indian Ocean ran out into the Atlantic to avoid adverse winds and to its surprise struck land which lay east of the treaty line and was not Africa. It was Brazil. Henceforth Portugal had an Atlantic as well as an Asian destiny. Though the main Portuguese effort still lay to the east, an Italian in Portuguese service, Amerigo Vespucci, soon afterwards ran far enough to the south to show that not merely islands but a whole new continent lay between Europe and Asia by a western route. Before long it was named after him, America, the name of the southern continent later being extended to the northern, too. In 1522, 30 years after Columbus's landfall in the Bahamas, a ship in the Spanish service completed the first voyage around the world. The commander under whom it sailed was Magellan, a Portuguese. He got as far as the Philippines, where he was killed, having discovered and sailed through the strait named after him. 18 of his original shipmates survived to reach Spain again. With this voyage and its demonstration that all the great oceans were interconnected, the prologue to the European age can be considered over. Just about a century of discovery and exploration had changed the shape of the world and the course of history. From this time the nations with access to the Atlantic would have opportunities denied to the landlocked powers of Central Europe and the Mediterranean. In the first place this meant Spain and Portugal, but they would be joined and surpassed by France, Holland and, above all, England, a collection of harbours incomparably placed at the centre of the newly enlarged hemisphere, all of them easily accessible from their shallow hinterland, and within easy striking distance of all the great European sea routes of the next 200 years. The enterprise behind these changes had only been possible because of a growing substratum of maritime skill and geographical knowledge. The new and characteristic figure of this movement was the professional explorer and navigator. Many of the earliest among them were, like Columbus himself, Italian. New knowledge, too, not only underlay the conception of these voyages and their successful technical performance, but also allowed Europeans to see their relationship with the world in a new way. To sum the matter up, Jerusalem ceased to be center of the world. The maps men began to draw, for all their crudity, are maps which show the basic structure of the real globe. In 1400 a Florentine had brought back from Constantinople a copy of Ptolemy's Geography. The view of the world it contained had been virtually forgotten for 1,000 years. In the 2nd century AD, Ptolemy's world already included the Canaries, Iceland and Ceylon, all of which found a place on his maps, along with the misapprehension that the Indian Ocean was totally enclosed by land. Translation of his text, misleading as it was, and the multiplication of copies first in manuscript and then in print, there were 6 editions between 1477, when it was first printed, and 1500, were a great stimulus to better map-making. The atlas, a collection of engraved and printed maps bound in a book, was invented in the 16th century. More men than ever could now buy or consult a picture of their world. With better projections, navigation was simpler, too. Here the great figure was a Dutchman, Gerhard Kramer, who is remembered as Mercator. He was the first man to print on a map the word America, and he invented the projection which is still today the most familiar, a map of the world devised as if it were an unrolled cylinder, with Europe at its center. The most striking thing about this progression is its cumulative and systematic nature. European expansion in the next phase of world history would be conscious and directed as it had never been before. Europeans had long wanted land and gold. The greed which lay at the heart of enterprise was not new. Nor was the religious zeal which sometimes inspired them and sometimes cloaked their springs of action even from the actors themselves. What was new was a growing confidence derived from knowledge and success. Europeans stood in 1500 at the beginning of an age in which their energy and confidence would grow seemingly without limit. The world did not come to them, they went out to it and took it. The scale of such a break with the past was not to be seen at once. In the Mediterranean and Balkans, Europeans still felt threatened and defensive. Navigation and seamanship still had far to go. Not until the 18th century, for example, would there be available a timekeeper accurate enough for exact sailing. But the way was opening to new relationships between Europe and the rest of the world, and between European countries themselves. Discovery would be followed by conquest and then, in due time, by the exploitation of vast new overseas resources by Europeans. A world revolution was beginning. An equilibrium, which had lasted 1,000 years, was dissolving. As the next 2 centuries unrolled, thousands of ships would put out year after year, day after day, from Lisbon, Seville, London, Bristol, Nantes, Antwerp and many other European ports, in search of trade and profit in other continents. They would sail to Calicut, Canton, Nagasaki. In time, they would be joined by ships from places where Europeans had established themselves overseas, from Boston and Philadelphia, Batavia and Macau. And during all that time, not one Arab dhow was to find its way to Europe. It was 1848 before a Chinese junk was brought to the Thames. Only in 1867 would a Japanese vessel cross the Pacific to San Francisco, long after the great sea lanes had been established by Europeans. In 1500 Europe is clearly recognizable as the center of a new civilization. Before long that civilization was to spread to other lands, too. Its heart was still religion. The institutional implications of this have already been touched upon. The Church was a great force of social regulation and government, whatever vicissitudes its central institution had suffered. But it was also the custodian of culture and the teacher of all men, the vehicle and vessel of civilization itself. Since the 13th century the burden of recording, teaching and study so long borne by the monks had been shared by friars and, more important still, by a new institution, in which friars sometimes played a big part, the universities. Bologna, Paris and Oxford were the first of them. By 1400 there were 53 more. The universities' importance for the future of Europe, though, was that their existence assured that when laymen came to be educated in substantial numbers, they too would long be formed by an institution under the control of the Church and suffused with religion. Furthermore, universities would be a great uniting, cosmopolitan cultural force. Their lectures were given in Latin, the language of the Church and the lingua franca of educated men. Its former preeminence is still commemorated in the vestigial Latin of university ceremonies and the names of degrees. Law, medicine, theology and philosophy all benefited from the new institution. Philosophy had all but disappeared into theology in the early medieval period. Then, as direct translation from Greek to Latin began in the 12th century, European scholars could read for themselves works of classical philosophy. The texts became available from Islamic sources. As the works of Aristotle and Hippocrates were turned into Latin, they were at first regarded with suspicion. This persisted until well into the 13th century, but gradually a search for reconciliation between the classical and Christian accounts of the world got underway, and it became clear, above all because of the work of two Dominicans, Albertus Magnus and his pupil Thomas Aquinas, that reconciliation and synthesis were indeed possible. So it came about that the classical heritage was recaptured and rechristened in Western Europe. Instead of providing a contrasting and critical approach to the theocentric culture of Christendom, it was incorporated into it. The classical world began to be seen as the forerunner of the Christian. For centuries man would turn for authority in matters intellectual to religion or to the classics. Of the latter it was Aristotle who enjoyed unique prestige. If it could not make him a saint, the Church at least treated him as a kind of prophet. The immediate evidence was the remarkable systematic and rationalist achievement of medieval scholasticism, the name given to the intellectual effort to penetrate the meaning of Christian teaching. Its strength lay in its embracing sweep, displayed nowhere more brilliantly than in the Summa Theologica of Aquinas, which has been judged, contrastingly, both for its crowning achievement and its brittle synthesis. It strove to account for all phenomena. Its weakness lay in its unwillingness to address itself to observation and experiment. Christianity gave the medieval mind a powerful training in logical thinking, but only a few men, isolated and untypical, could dimly see the possibility of breaking through authority to a truly experimental method. Nevertheless, within the Christian cultural achievement the first signs of liberation from the enclosed world of the early Middle Ages can be seen. Paradoxically, Christendom owed them to Islam, though for a long time there was deep suspicion and fear in the attitudes of ordinary men towards Arab civilization. There was also ignorance. Not until 1143 was a Latin translation of the Quran available. Easy and tolerant relationships between the faithful and the infidel, both sides thought in the same terms, were possible only in a few places. In Sicily and Spain, above all, the two cultures could meet. There the great work of translation of the 12th and 13th centuries took place. Emperor Frederick II was regarded with the deepest suspicion because although he persecuted heretics he was known to welcome Jews and Saracens to his court at Palermo. Toledo, the old Visigothic capital, was another especially important center. In such places scribes copied and recopied the Latin texts of the bestsellers of the next 6 centuries. Euclid's works began a career of being copied, recopied and then printed, which may well have meant that in the end they surpassed the success of any book except the Bible, at least until the 20th century, and became the foundation of mathematics teaching in Western Europe until the 19th century. In such ways the Hellenistic world began again to irrigate the thought of Europeans. Roughly speaking, the Islamic transmission of antiquity began with astrology, astronomy and mathematics, subjects closely linked to one another. Ptolemy's astronomy reached Europe by this route and was found a satisfactory basis for cosmology and navigation until the 16th century. Islamic cartography was in fact more advanced than European for most of the Middle Ages, and Arab sailors used the magnet for navigation well before their European counterparts, though it was the latter who were to carry through the great oceanic discoveries. The astrolabe had been a Greek invention, but its use was spread in Europe by Arab writings. When Chaucer wrote his treatise on its use, he took as his model an earlier Arab one. The arrival from Arab sources of a new numeration and the decimal point, both of Indian origin, was perhaps most important of all. The latter's usefulness in simplifying calculation can be easily tested by trying to write sums in Roman numerals. Of the sciences of observation other than astronomy, the most important to come to Europe from Islam was medicine. Besides providing access to the medical works of Aristotle, Galen and Hippocrates, direct translation from the Greek was not begun until after 1100. Arabic sources and teachers also brought into European practice a huge body of therapeutic, anatomical and pharmacological knowledge built up by Arab physicians. The prestige of Arab learning and science made easier the acceptance of more subtly dangerous and subversive ideas. Arab philosophy and theology, too, began to be studied in Europe. In the end, even European art seems to have been affected by Islam, for the invention of perspective, which was to transform painting, is said to have come from 13th century Arab Spain. Europe offered little in exchange except the technology of gunnery. In the Middle Ages, Europe owed more to Islam than to any other contemporary source. For all their dramatic and exotic interest, the travels of a Marco Polo or the missionary wanderings of friars in Central Asia did little to change Europe. The quantity of goods exchanged with other parts of the world was still tiny, even in 1500. Technically, Europe owed for certain to East Asia only the art of making silk, which had reached her from the Eastern Empire, and paper, which, though made in China in the 2nd century AD, took until the 13th to reach Europe and then did so again by way of Arab Spain. Nor did ideas reach Europe from nearer Asia, unless like Indian mathematics they had undergone refinement in the Arabic crucible. Given the permeability of Islamic culture, it seems less likely that this was because, in some sense, Islam at most times insulated Europe from the Orient by imposing a barrier between them, than because China and India were simply too far away. They had hardly been accessible, after all, in pre-Christian antiquity, when communications had been no more difficult. The reintegration of classical and Christian, manifested in work like that of Aquinas, was an answer, 10 centuries late, to Tertullian's jibing question about what Athens had to do with Jerusalem. In one of the supreme works of art of the Middle Ages, some would judge the supreme, the Divine Comedy of Dante, the importance of the reattachment of the world of Christendom to its predecessor is already to be seen. Dante describes his journey through hell, purgatory and paradise, the universe of Christian truth. Yet his guide is not a Christian, but a pagan, the classical poet Virgil. This role is much more than decorative. Virgil is an authoritative guide to truth, for, before Christ, he foretold him. The Roman poet has become a prophet to stand beside those of the Old Testament. Though the notion of a link with antiquity had never quite disappeared, as attempts by enthusiastic chroniclers to link the Franks or the Britons to the descendants of the Trojans had shown, there is in Dante's attitude something marking an epoch. The acceptance of the classical world by Christendom, for all the scholastic clutter of its surroundings, had made possible a change which has usually been seen as more radical, the great revival of humanistic letters of the 14th to 16th centuries. It was a revival long dominated by Latin. Only in 1497 was the first Greek grammar to appear in print. One emblematic figure of that passage in cultural history was Erasmus of Rotterdam, sometime a monk and later, as the foremost exponent of classical studies of his day, the correspondent of most of the leading humanists. Yet he still saw his classics as the entrance to the supreme study of Scripture, and his most important book was an edition of the Greek New Testament. The effects of printing a good text of the Bible were, indeed, to be revolutionary, but Erasmus had no intention of overthrowing religious order, for all the vigor and wit with which he had mocked and teased puffed-up churchmen, and for all the provocation to independent thought which his books and letters provided. His roots lay in the piety of a 15th-century mystical movement in the Low Countries called the Devotio Moderna, not in pagan antiquity. Some of the men who began to cultivate the study of classical authors, and to invoke explicitly pagan classical ideals, invented the notion of the Middle Ages or a Middle Age to emphasize their sense of novelty. They in their turn were later seen as men of a rebirth of a lost tradition, a renaissance of classical antiquity. Yet they were formed in the culture which the great changes in Christian civilization from the 12th century onwards had made possible. To speak of Renaissance may be helpful if we keep in mind the limitations of the context in which we use the word, but it falsifies history if we take it to imply a transformation of culture marking a radical break with medieval Christian civilization. The Renaissance-ism was a useful myth, one of those ideas which help men to master their own bearings and therefore to act more effectively. Whatever the Renaissance may be, there is no clear line in European history which separates it from the Middle Ages, however we like to define them. What can be noticed almost everywhere, though, is a change of emphasis. It shows especially in the relation of the age to the past. Men of the 13th century, like those of the 16th, portrayed the great men of antiquity in the garb of their own day. Alexander the Great at one time looks like a medieval king, later, Shakespeare's Caesar wears not a toga but doublet and hose. There is, that is to say, no real historical sense in either of these pictures of the past, no awareness of the immense differences between past and present men and things. Instead, history was seen at best as a school of examples. The difference between the two attitudes is that in the medieval view, antiquity could also be scrutinized for the signs of a divine plan, evidence of whose existence once more triumphantly vindicated the teachings of the Church. This was St. Augustine's legacy and what Dante accepted. But by 1500 something else was also being discerned in the past, equally unhistorical, but, men felt, more helpful to their age and predicament. Some saw a classical inspiration, possibly even pagan, distinct from the Christian, and the new attention to classical writings was one result. The idea of Renaissance is especially linked to innovation in art. Late medieval Europe had seen much of this. It seems as vigorous and creative as any of the other great centers of civilized tradition from the 12th century onwards. In music, drama and poetry, new forms and styles were created which move us still. By the 15th century, though, it is already clear that they can in no sense be confined to the service of God. Art is becoming autonomous. The eventual consummation of this change was the major aesthetic expression of the Renaissance, transcending by far its stylistic innovations, revolutionary though these were. It is the clearest sign that the Christian synthesis and the ecclesiastical monopoly of culture are breaking up. The slow divergence of classical and Christian mythology was one expression of it, others were the appearance of the Romance and Provençal love poetry, which owed much to Arabic influence, the deployment of the Gothic style in secular buildings such as the great guildhalls of the new cities, or the rise of a vernacular literature for educated laymen, of which perhaps the supreme example is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Such changes are not easily dated, because acceptance did not always follow rapidly on innovation. In literature, there was a particularly severe physical restriction on what could be done because of a long-enduring shortage of texts. It was not until well into the 16th century that the first edition of Chaucer's complete works was printed and published. By then a revolution in thinking was undoubtedly underway, of which all the tendencies so far touched on form parts but which was something much more than the sum of them, and it owes almost everything to the coming of the printed book. Even a vernacular text such as the Canterbury Tales could not reach a wide public until printing made large numbers of copies easily available. When this happened, the impact of books was vastly magnified. This was true of all classes of book: poetry, history, philosophy, technology and, above all, the Bible itself. The effect was the most profound change in the diffusion of knowledge and ideas since the invention of writing. It was the greatest cultural revolution of these centuries. With hindsight, it can be seen as the start of an acceleration of the diffusion of information which is still underway. Although already used there in a different form, the new technique owed nothing to stimulus from China except very indirectly, through the availability of paper. From the 14th century, rags were used in Europe to make paper of good quality, and this was one of the elements which contributed to the printing revolution. Others were the principle of printing itself. The impressing of images on textiles had been practiced in 12th century Italy, the use of cast metal for typefaces instead of wood, already used to provide blocks for playing cards, calendars and religious images, the availability of oil-based ink, and, above all, the use of movable metal type. It was the last invention which was crucial. Although the details are obscure, and experiments with wood letters were going on at the beginning of the 15th century in Haarlem, there seems to be no good reason not to credit it to the man whose name has traditionally been associated with it, Johannes Gutenberg, the diamond polisher of Mainz. In about 1450 he and his colleagues brought the elements of modern printing together, and in 1455 there appeared what is agreed to be the first true book printed in Europe, the Gutenberg Bible. Gutenberg's own business career was by then a failure. Something prophetic of a new age of commerce appears in the fact that he was probably undercapitalized. The accumulation of equipment and type was an expensive business, and a colleague from whom he borrowed money took him to court for his debts. Judgment went against Gutenberg, who lost his press, so that the Bible, when it appeared, was not his property. Happily, the story does not end there. Gutenberg was in the end ennobled by the Archbishop of Mainz, in recognition of what he had done. But he had launched a revolution. By 1500, it has been calculated, some 35,000 separate editions of books, incunabula, as they were called, had been published. This probably means between 15 and 20 million copies. There may well have been already at that date fewer copies of books in manuscript in the whole world. In the following century there were between 150,000 and 200,000 separate editions and perhaps 10 times as many copies printed. Such a quantitative change merges into one which is qualitative. The culture which resulted from the coming of printing with movable type was as different from any earlier one as it is from one which takes radio and television for granted. The modern age was the age of print. It is interesting but unsurprising that the first printed European book should have been the Bible, the sacred text at the heart of medieval civilization. Through the printing press, knowledge of it was to be diffused as never before and with incalculable results. In 1450 it would have been very unusual for a parish priest to own a Bible, or even to have easy access to one. A century later, it was becoming likely that he had one, and in 1650 it would have been remarkable if he had not. The first printed Bibles were texts of the Latin Vulgate, but vernacular versions soon followed. A German Bible was printed in 1466, Catalan, Czech, Italian and French translations followed before the end of the century, but Englishmen had to wait for a New Testament printed in their language until 1526. Into the diffusion of sacred texts, of which the Bible was only the most important, pious laymen and churchmen alike poured resources for 50 or 60 years. Presses were even set up in monastic houses. Meanwhile, grammars, histories and, above all, the classical authors, edited by the humanists, also appeared in increasing numbers. Another innovation from Italy was the introduction of simpler, clearer typefaces modelled upon the manuscript of Florentine scholars, who were themselves copying Carolingian minuscule. The impact could not be contained. The domination of the European consciousness by printed media would be the outcome. With some prescience the Pope suggested to bishops in 1501 that the control of printing might be the key to preserving the purity of the faith. But more was involved than any specific threat to doctrine, important as that might be. The nature of the book itself began to change. Once a rare work of art, whose mysterious knowledge was accessible only to a few, it became a tool and artifact for the many. Print was to provide new channels of communication for governments and a new medium for artists. The diffusion of pictorial and architectural style in the 16th century was much more rapid and widespread than ever before because of the growing availability of the engraved print, and would give a new impetus to the diffusion of technology. A huge demand for literacy and therefore education would be stimulated by it. No single change marks so clearly the ending of one era and the beginning of another. It is very hard to say exactly what all this meant for Europe's role in the coming era of world history. By 1500, there was certainly much to give confidence to the few Europeans who were likely to think at all about these things. The roots of their civilization lay in a religion which taught them they were a people voyaging in time, their eyes on a future made a little more comprehensible and perhaps a little less frightening by contemplation of past perils navigated and awareness of a common goal. As a result, Europe was to be the first civilization aware of time not as endless, though perhaps cyclical, pressure, but as continuing change in a certain direction, as progress. The chosen people of the Bible, after all, were going somewhere. They were not simply people to whom inexplicable things happened which had to be passively endured. From the simple acceptance of change soon sprang the will to live with constant change, which was the peculiarity of modern man. Secularized and far away from their origins, such ideas could be very important. The advance of science soon provided an example. In another sense, too, the Christian heritage was decisive, for, after the fall of Byzantium, Europeans believed that they alone possessed it, or in effect alone, for there was little sense among ordinary folk of what Slav, Nestorian or Coptic Christianity might be. Even with the Ottomans to face, Europe in 1500 had left behind the Dark Age sense of being simply chaotic leftovers from antiquity. It was looking towards new horizons and new worlds. Late medieval Europeans had thus wrought infinitely more than they could have anticipated. Yet such implications required time for their development. In 1500 there was still little to show that the future belonged to them. Such contacts as they had with other peoples by no means demonstrated the clear superiority of their own way. Portuguese in West Africa might manipulate the indigenous people to their own ends and relieve them of their gold dust and slaves, but in Persia or India they stood in the presence of great empires whose spectacle often dazzled them. In the half-light of a dawning modernity, the weight of religion remains the best clue to the reality of Europe's first civilization. Religion provided a significant part of the stability of a culture that was slowly to embrace change. But except in the shortest term, processes of change were not something most Europeans would have been aware of in the 15th century. For all men, the deepest determinant of their lives was still the slow but ever-repeated passage of the seasons, a rhythm which set the pattern of work and leisure, poverty and prosperity, of the routines of home, workshop and study. English judges and university teachers still work to a year originally divided by the need to get in the harvest. It is only in a very special, long perspective that we can rightly speak of centuries during which this went on and on as ones of revolutionary changes. Truly revolutionary as some changes were, even the most obvious of them, the growth of a town, an onset of plague, the displacement of one noble family by another, the building of a cathedral or the collapse of a castle, all took place in a remarkably unchanged setting. The shapes of the fields tilled by English peasants in 1500 were often still those visited by the men who wrote them down in Domesday Book, over 400 years before, and when men went to visit the nuns of Lacock in order to wind up their house in the 1530s, they found, to their amazement, these aristocratic ladies still speaking among themselves the Norman French commonly used in noble families 3 centuries earlier. Such immense inertia must never be forgotten. It was made all the more impressive and powerful by the fleeting lives of most men and women of the Middle Ages. Only very deep in the humus of this society did there lie a future. Perhaps the key to that future's relationship with the past can be located in the fundamental Christian dualism of this life and the world to come, the earthly and the heavenly. This was to prove an irritant of great value, secularized in the end as a new critical instrument, the contrast of what is and what might be, of actual and ideal. In it, Christianity secreted an essence to be utilized against itself, for in the end it would make possible the independent critical stance, a complete break with the world Aquinas and Erasmus both knew. The idea of autonomous criticism would only be born very gradually, though it can be traced in many individual adumbrations between 1300 and 1700, but they only go to show that, once again, sharp dividing lines between medieval and modern are matters of expository convenience, not of historical reality.